So joining me now from her home in Calgary is good friend of the show, friend of mine, Michelle Stirling from Friends of Science. Michelle, I wanted to have you on the show because you're actually doing something, and we'll get to that in a little bit, uh, in a way that I think you're doing work that nobody else is to alleviate some of this anxiety that all the adults are infecting kids with about climate change. But first, please, because you've done some work on this, you've done actually a few videos on the Friends of Science YouTube channel about how kids just sort of need to chill out. But I mean, the Daily Mail is one of the world's largest publications. I think on some days it is the world's largest publication. And this isn't the only article of its kind that I've seen, that some children are finding spending time in nature distressing because it can trigger feelings of anxiety and despair linked to climate change. And the researchers use words like the children are triggered by the natural world and their inability to control what was happening to the unraveling biosphere. It seems like these studies are designed to elicit a certain response from the kids. It's like, you know, a solution in search of a problem.
Yes, well, that study is, quite a novel thing, because this woman reviewed a number of different pieces of research that are out there. Her name is Louise Chawla, and and these are all quite diverse pieces of sociological research on children's perceptions of nature. And most of the thrust of the paper seems to be trying to incorporate the idea that if you love nature, then you'll be a good eco-citizen, you'll recycle, you'll be kind to pets and animals and such like, and your life will be fulfilled. And there's a lot of talk in there about how spending nice time in nature makes one feel at one with nature and such like. And one of the interesting things is that one of the studies she mentions had a survey of children that were 2.5 years old, which, and so because children can't really talk at that age, they kind of used their parents as the transference method. So, what are you really trying to ascertain from a 2.5-year-old? Who can't speak and has no greater understanding of the world? A child who, when their mother or father leaves the room, they often will start crying because their parent is gone, and they don't quite understand that they're just in the other room. So you're surveying people who have no sense of the complex world, and yet trying to draw some conclusions about how they feel in nature. One of the other things I found quite interesting is that one of the surveys found that children as young as 5 are afraid of the world getting too hot. So, you start to question, what have we inculcated in the very smallest children of this world, but fear of the environment. And then they wonder why they're afraid to go into nature.
I think it's quite evil to do this to young children. I think young children need to live with hope for the future and not fear that they're in some sort of apocalyptic end times. I mean, if a doomsday cult did this to children, we would call it child abuse. But when the environmental movement does it, we say, okay, well, it's a legitimate psychological disorder, this anxiety that kids are experiencing, and apparently only taxes fix it. Now, you have actually been sort of on the forefront of trying to undo what I would call the Greta Thunberg effect, this amplification of children's role on the front lines against climate change. I mean, Greta Thunberg is telling children that not only is the world going to end because of your parents, but if you do not, if it is to be saved, it must be saved by the children. I think that's a horrific responsibility to put on kids, but you've been actually doing your best to undo this through a series of videos. Like you have a video, popular video over on the Friends of Science YouTube page that says, I don't want to die. And you break down the climate exploitation of children.
Hmm. Well, I Don't Want to Die stems from a mother in Toronto whose child was at school, and I think it was the 3% project that came in, and they showed, how catastrophically the world is going to end to a group of children. Children were being funneled in and out of the library for this presentation, and a lot of the kids were like, "I don't want to die." So this very brave mother went to the press and got a story published about it, exposing this. And I don't think that parents are really aware of the kind of influence that's going on in schools from these scaremongers. And I guess in one sense, we can see that with the We Charity thing blowing up, where people finally realize, wait a minute, our kids are being indoctrinated in schools by people with, questionable motives. And that's what we see with the whole Greta Thunberg thing, where behind her are a group of green billionaires who are pushing carbon offset trading. That's their whole mandate. And she's like their walking native ad. Native advertising is sort of a recent development in advertising where a sponsored article appears in the news as if a credible editorial article sanctioned by a newspaper and written by journalists when it's really a sponsored thing. So people perceive it as a real news story. So Greta is perceived as a real citizen, traveling the world with her message, but actually behind her are people who own Time magazine, people who own a big ad agency, people who are running a social engineering, social media platform with, when they started with their IPO, they had 100 million users. That's the kind of power and influence they wanted to get out there. Um, and actually, left wing journalist and author Corey Morningstar has written lots and lots and lots of this. She's done fantastic research on this whole sort of capitalist, green crony capitalist movement behind Greta Thunberg. And how people are just being incredibly duped by it all. But it's really tragic because we have children who are terrified now of nature, of their future. Existential doom is very high. I was reading a report the other day about a child in I think it was in Australia who was suffering from climate delusion. They almost died from not drinking water because they thought if they drank more water, it would mean that Australian bushfires would be out of control. So like people are highly suggestible. So when you take small people and you give them these impressions, it can just go right to the um, nth degree with them, and they don't have a context to make better sense of it, especially if their parents are also, eco nuts.
Yeah, especially if this is the world in which children live, and it's hard for kids to escape it, even if they have reasonable parents. Um, the schools are completely infected with this. This climate doom and gloom. It's the common parlance of science in school. Um, and so it's hard for even good parents to prevent their children from becoming contaminated with this sort of worry. If you'd like to get access to my show, as well as other great TV style shows too, like Ezra's Nightly, Ezra Levant Show, and David Menzies' Friday night show, Rebel Roundup, just go to rebelnews.com/subscribe. That's rebelnews.com/subscribe.